I mentioned on the last video that only one of the predictive components of who is likely to appraise something as threatening or exceeding his or her coping resources and therefore more at risk for stress-related illness because they trigger the fight or flight response is the nature of the stressor. But you know that alone is not enough because you can have multiple people experience the same thing. And some will interpret it as very threatening and exceeding their coping abilities and trigger that fight or flight response and stress-related illness, and other people won't. And in fact, this is going to be relevant later on in this class when we talk about trauma and resilience. Why is it that some people seem to come out of highly traumatic experiences with a sort of post-traumatic growth, whereas other people experience post-traumatic stress disorder or something more along those lines? So if you join me on slide number 16, there are individual differences outside of the event itself, things that define people and make them different from one another, that influence the way they will appraise or cognitively interpret an event. Individual personality characteristics, emotional state, both relevant here. Back to conscientious neuroticism and perfectionism. The more conscientious people are, the less likely they are to interpret something as exceeding their coping resources. And therefore, they're less likely to trigger fight or flight and more protected from stress-related illness. On the flip side, people who have higher neurotic tendencies or are more likely to be maladaptive perfectionists. They are the opposite. They are more likely than the average person to interpret an event as exceeding their coping resources in all the domains we talked about. Therefore, more likely to trigger the fight or flight response, therefore more likely to experience health-related problems when they experience activators or stressors. Emotional state matters too. Back to those toxic emotions you learned about. See how things build on each other from the beginning of class? We're building a house. A mental house. Toxic emotions, depression, anxiety, chronic anger, or hostility all make a person more likely to interpret activators or stressors or environmental demands in a way that exceeds their coping resources, therefore, more likely to trigger fight or flight responsivity, therefore, more likely to experience a stress-related illness. Now, why? Personality characteristics and emotional states influence your attributional style. So go back when you learned about attributional style in this class. Remember that attributional style is a relatively stable way that people interpret events in their lives. You learned about this when you learned about optimistic versus pessimistic dispositional style, right? Attributional style. Dispositional optimist versus dispositional pessimist had a different chronic attributional style for dealing with events in their lives. Well, your personality characteristics and the emotional states you tend to experience also influence your attributional style. That is going to impact the way you appraise specific events that happen to you. So when you're confronted with a potential stressor, activator, environmental demand, your attributional style is going to influence whether you're more likely to interpret it in a way that's threatening or not threatening. Remember, Martin Seligman's explanatory or attributional style had 3 elements: location of the cause, stability of the cause over time, and effect of the event. Location of the cause had to do with whether or not people have a tendency to blame themselves, internal attribution, or something outside of them, external attribution. Stability of the cause, remember, had to do with whether they thought whatever was causing this event to happen was going to remain over time or was going to be temporary. And remember, effect of the event had to do with whether or not people interpret the experience as something that is unique to the event or something that's going to generalize to other aspects of their lives and impact their lives on a widespread scale. Remember, dispositional pessimists have a tendency when they experience threatening or negative events, difficult events, adverse events, to make internal stable global attributions, which then makes those appraisals make them believe that the event is more threatening, and it's more likely then to activate a stress response, which puts them at risk for health-related problems. Dispositional optimists, complete opposite. Adverse events, challenging events, negative events, they tend to make external unstable specific attributions, which then causes them to appraise those events in a non-threatening way, which then makes them less likely to activate stress response, fight or flight physiology, which makes them less likely to engage a stress response, less likely to experience stress-related health problems. 17, I want to pick up on a few more psychological aspects of what influences the way people interpret events. We just talked about the nature of the event itself on the prior video. In this video so far, we've talked about personality and emotional profiles. We've talked about how that influences explanatory style. Now let's talk, slide number 17, the importance of predictability and control. Predictability has to do with how much, what it sounds like, how much a person could have prepared for something versus could not have prepared for it because there was no way to predict it was going to take place. The more predictable an event, the less likely people are to appraise it as threatening. The less predictable an event, the more likely people are to appraise it as threatening. Consider a pop quiz versus a scheduled exam. If I tell you we're going to have a test at a certain time, you can prepare for it. If you never know when the test is going to happen, it can be any day, you're going to feel more uneasy because you're not sure you're prepared for it when it's going to happen. So knowledge that a potential stressor will occur does generally, on average, produce lower chances of a threat appraisal or a stress appraisal. Lack of knowledge tends to lead to feelings of helplessness, futility, like nothing I do is going to matter, and chronic arousal, which then puts people at greater risk for triggering that fight or flight response. Having said that, even here, even with events that could not be prepared for, even with events that are not able to be predicted, individual differences, personality plays a role in whether or not they are likely to trigger an appraisal that is threatening and therefore fight or flight physiology. There's something called tolerance for ambiguity. And this is considered to be a personality trait that varies across people. Some people have an extremely high tolerance for ambiguity, some have an extremely low tolerance for ambiguity, and then some people fall anywhere along that spectrum. Tolerance for ambiguity has to do with how comfortable or uncomfortable you are in situations that either were not predictable, that you may not be able to resolve, that you're not sure how to resolve, or that at present don't really have a resolution. Some people are extraordinarily comfortable with that. They tend to be go with the flow kind of people. Oh, whatever happens, I'll figure it out. Those kind of people. The antithesis of that, people with very low tolerance for ambiguity, are people who need everything planned, everything scheduled, extraordinarily uncomfortable when something happens they weren't aware was going to take place, and then everything in between. So think about yourself as we're going through this topic. Where would you fall along that spectrum? Also, self-efficacy is relevant here. Self-efficacy is not the same as self-esteem. Self-esteem is a general sense of worth, that you believe you're a worthwhile person. That's not what this is. Self-efficacy is much more specific. Self-efficacy has to do with your belief that your actions will result in successful outcomes, that you have the requisite skills and abilities to make something happen successfully. If people have high self-efficacy, then an unpredictable event is less likely to be threatening to them. If people have low self-efficacy, an unpredictable event is much more likely to be interpreted or appraised as exceeding their coping resources. The worst combination in terms of the chances of appraising an event as threatening and therefore triggering fight or flight responsivity in the body is people who have low self-efficacy combined with an unpredictable event, especially if the person also has very low tolerance for ambiguity. That combination of things would create a very high probability of an appraisal of that event as threatening and exceeding one's resources, and therefore triggering a stress response or fight or flight physiology, which would then put somebody at risk for health-related problems that are stress triggered. Control matters too. This has to do with how much control a person has or perceives she has over an event. Control is somewhat environmentally determined and somewhat determined by personality factors. Sometimes an event happens that we literally could not possibly exert control over. It's completely environmentally determined. Like a company you work for tells you they're downsizing and there's going to be layoffs, and there's literally nothing you can do about that decision. However, perception of control is also a personality characteristic that differs across people. This is called locus of control. We have talked about this at the beginning of the semester in various other contexts with various other topics. To refresh your memory, locus of control has to do with across most circumstances. Who do people believe is responsible for what happens to them? People with strong internal locus of control believe under most circumstances, as long as they exert the time and effort, they can influence what happens to them in their lives. People who have an externalized locus of control believe in most circumstances, no matter what they do, what happens to them is influenced by something else. Other people, powerful others, luck, fate, but not them. People who have an internal locus of control are much less likely to appraise events as threatening, even if they're somewhat unpredictable, than people who have an external locus of control. It makes sense because people who believe most circumstances can be influenced by their actions are going to feel less threatened by things, even if they were somewhat unpredictable. People who generally feel like whatever happens to them is outside of their control are going to feel extremely threatened when something happens, especially something unpredictable, but anything really that could be potentially threatening. Now, predictability and control are related. They are related. The experience of many unpredictable events in someone's life. So if you're going along in life, especially as a young person growing up in your formative years, and a lot of things are happening to somebody that are outside of his or her control, they are likely to develop in adolescence into early adulthood a strong external locus of control. They've learned the world is an unpredictable, scary place, and therefore they're going to be more likely to interpret events that happen to them in the future as threatening and exceeding their resources. So very important to keep in mind as I close this video, okay? As I close this video, whether or not somebody appraises a potential stressor or activator or environmental demand as threatening, as stressful, as exceeding his or her coping resources, is influenced by the nature of the stressor itself, as I've explained those different possible types of stressors, personality factors, attributional or explanatory style, predictability and control, and then things like personality characteristics that relate to predictability and control, like self-efficacy, locus of control, tolerance for ambiguity. And these factors all come together to determine whether or not, in the face of various potential stressors, someone is likely to interpret events in a way that puts them at risk for health-related problems versus does not put them at risk for health-related problems.